So I'm talking today about neurodiversity and inclusivity, and it's a real honour for me to talk about this topic because it's quite a personal one to me. And the presentation I'm giving is the same that I presented at Art of Retreat in North America last year. And I just think that this is a topic that we should all learn more about and be mindful of as we navigate through life. So I'm going to be covering the broader topics of disability, the social model of disability, neurodiversity and the neurodiversity paradigm. And I'm going to talk specifically about autism because that's the most relevant and relatable to me and my experiences, and some of the myths and misconceptions around it. And then once we've covered those broader topics, I want to look more closely at how we can be more inclusive in our classes and communities, and delving into how neurodivergent people experience the world and how we can create spaces that are safer for them. So I'm kind of referencing notes here, and I'm not really sure. I keep getting confused about where I'm looking. So sorry, I'm not looking straight at you guys. So next slide, Kel. I can't see the slides on the screen, but I'm assuming they're up there, right?
I'm one step behind. Bear with me a moment.
Okay. So while Kel's getting that slide up, it's just a slide about me. I can tell you a little bit about me. And how I came to be presenting. So it's the next slide, yeah. How I came to be presenting here on this topic. So this is me in the slide. You can see there, I am 38. I'm a parkour instructor and a breathwork facilitator. And I'm a mum to these three beautiful little humans, and they're 10, 7, and 4. We are unschoolers, so we kind of live life as much as we can as if school doesn't exist. We kind of live Can everyone hear me okay? There was just some weird feedback then. And we are all neurodivergent. So I have been neurodivergent my whole life, but I didn't actually know what that meant until my eldest son was about 4 years old. And I started to suspect that he wasn't following a typical pathway of development. He was doing things differently to what I read he should be, or what other kids around him were doing. And it was obvious to me that he was experiencing the world differently. Now, this necessarily wasn't a bad thing at all, but there was a lot that I didn't really understand. And so he was diagnosed as autistic a few weeks before his 5th birthday. Then his younger brother was diagnosed a few years later. My youngest doesn't have a formal diagnosis, but I believe that she is autistic, definitely neurodivergent. And their father and myself both went through the diagnosis process and received our own different diagnoses as well, I guess. And during kind of the journey of finding out that he was autistic, I was lucky enough to develop some really meaningful friendships with actually autistic adults who have autistic children, who believe in respectful parenting as I do, and believe that neurodiversity is something to be celebrated, and that autism isn't a burden or a tragedy or something that needs to be cured. So I'm really grateful to have met them and to know without question that my children aren't damaged or a burden or any of the things that society tries to convince us. But I'm also acutely aware that society is not set up to accommodate neurodivergent people, and that we can be disabled, sometimes quite significantly, by society because of misinformation, damaging assumptions, lack of respect, and a lack of knowledge and education. So if we move to the next slide. So how does this all relate to parkour? For me, so when my eldest was about 5.5. We were on a family holiday to Sydney in 2016. And I noticed he was moving through the city differently to everyone else. He was swinging around poles, jumping on walls, balancing on curbs, going under park benches. He was avoiding like the cracks in the pavement. His parkour vision seemed to be innate. He was playing his own version of The Floor is Lava without even realizing, like, using the sidewalk just wasn't an option for him at all. And a few months before we went on this trip, I'd read about this thing called Parkour. And I said to him while he was kind of moving around everywhere, "Hey, Jack, I think there's this thing called Parkour I think you'd really like." And he was like, "What's that?" And I said, "I didn't really know too much, but I think it's about getting over obstacles." And he was like, "Yeah, that sounds really cool." So when we got back to Perth, I Googled Parkour in Perth and found Perth Parkour, got in touch with the president at the time, which was Isaac, and we started homeschooling classes in 2016. And Jack was 5 and Leo was 3 and my youngest was just a baby. And 4 years later, we still do classes weekly. And I watched from the sidelines for about 8 months. And with a little encouragement, I ended up going to classes myself, and the rest is history. It's kind of changed the trajectory of my life, being involved in parkour. I was the president of Perth Parkour for a while, and I've traveled over and presented on this topic in the States. So it's been really cool. And the homeschool classes that Isaac ran with us were only really small. There's only about eight kids. And I would say that 95% of the kids are neurodivergent in this class. And we're all unschoolers, so we value freedom and creativity. We avoid punishment. We believe in child-led natural learning. So when we started, we let our coach know this. And with that in mind, he tailored the class to suit their needs. So there's a lot of flexibility. There's a lot of input from the students. There's a lot of freedom for the kids to move in and out of the classes they choose. And it's a very accepting environment. And it's really, I've watched my kids thrive in that kind of environment. And it's, I've always kind of facilitated natural movement with my kids from when they were babies, like observed and trusted them with their movements. And I really saw parkour mesh with this mindset and just witness their confidence in themselves kind of skyrocket, which is really, really cool. And so all of these experiences got me thinking about parkour and neurodiversity, and that I believe parkour is a really great fit for neurodivergent people, especially kids. And I'm really passionate about people learning about neurodiversity. And then so when Kel asked me to do this, I was really keen to share what I've learned and what I know. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to move through these ones fairly quickly. They're not related specifically to parkour. It's more of the broader kind of topics. So looking at the disability, ableism, the social model of disability, neurodiversity and the neurodiversity paradigm, and autism. So if you have any questions, maybe save them till the end unless it's like really pressing. So we're going to start with the next slide. What is disability? So I'm just going to read a definition that comes from the World Health Organization. Disabilities is an umbrella term covering impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. An impairment is a problem in body function or structure. An activity limitation is a difficulty encountered by an individual in executing a task or action, while a participation restriction is a problem experienced by an individual in involvement in life situations. Disability is thus not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. Overcoming the difficulties faced by people with disabilities requires interventions to remove environmental and social barriers. So there's a lot I like about this definition because it talks about the environmental and social barriers faced by disabled people. It's It doesn't just talk about their problem. And I think that is a really important distinction to make when we're thinking about disabilities and inclusivity. The environment and the social and cultural aspects just can't be ignored. So if we look at the medical model, so we're moving on to the next slide, looking at the medical model versus the social model of disability. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities started the official shift in the way disability was recognised internationally, changing the way we view and address disability from something called the medical model to what we now use, which is the social model. So this infographic here was created by Erin Human, who's a friend of mine who lives in the US, who is multiply neurodivergent. And I think it outlines the basics of these models really well. So you can see the medical model, things like the person is disabled by abnormalities and deficits of their own body and brain. Disabled people are broken, abnormal, damaged versions of a human being and should be fixed, cured, or prevented. The disabled person should adjust to fit into society since they are the one who is not normal. So if you compare that to the social model of disability, so the person is disabled by their environment and its physical, attitudinal, communication, and social barriers. Disabled people are normal, varied varieties of human being and should have equal rights and access to society just as they are. The disabled person should be supported by society because they are equal and have a right to inclusion. And since the disabled person is inherently equal, they have a right to autonomy, choice, and free and informed consent in their own lives. So because the dominant narrative surrounding disability is kind of based on that medical model, the shift in thinking can be really difficult for people to achieve. It requires seeing disability as socially constructed. It requires a change in attitude, communication, and the physical and cultural environment. When we view disability through this lens, it makes inclusivity more achievable because it puts the onus on society to adapt and change instead of placing the burden on the disabled person. And ableism is something that makes it very hard to achieve this shift in thinking about disability from the medical model to the social model. So if we move on to the next slide, and I'm guessing that a lot of you would have heard of this term ableism. Basically, ableism is the discrimination and social prejudice against disabled people. It is the belief that the disability is a mistake or something that needs to be corrected, rather than simply a result of human diversity. It assumes and propagates the belief that disabled people are less than or not worthy. They're often not respected or appreciated. They need to be fixed. They're not fully autonomous, multifaceted humans. And ableism is the practices and dominant attitudes in our society that devalue and limit the potential of a disabled person. So it can manifest in many different ways, for example, through the words that we use. So using the R word or crazy, stupid, lame, saying nut job or what are you, deaf or blind. More and more people are saying, oh, that's so autistic or that's so OCD. It's using disability to describe something negative or bad or to insult someone or be condescending. So the words we use really matter. And it's also evident through our actions. So for example, not providing accessible environments. So no ramps, no image descriptions, no closed captions, no braille, or through lack of representation in media and communities, the disproportionately high rates of abuse, neglect and murder of disabled people, the negative stereotyping, exclusion of disabled people in almost all social movements and conversations. It's really very pervasive and embedded in our culture. So as a result, just like racism, we can all be ableist at different times. And I wanted to give an example of a form of ableism that people don't often realize is actually ableist, and that's inspiration porn. And some of you may have heard of this term. Inspiration porn is the portrayal of people with disabilities as inspirational solely or in part on the basis of their disability. So the term was coined in 2012 by the amazing disability rights activist Stella Young, who's unfortunately no longer with us. And she's written about it, and she also has a really, really good TED talk. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to check it out. If we move to the next slide. So Stella talks about the images that you might see like splashed across the internet, disabled children accompanied by quotes like "the only disability in life is a bad attitude," or "what's your excuse," or "before you quit, try." And Stella says that quote, "the only disability in life is a bad attitude," the reason that's bullshit is no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshelf and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn those books into Braille. And Stella goes on to say, "Let me be clear about the intent of this inspiration porn. It's there so that non-disabled people can put their worries into perspective, so that they can go, oh, well, if that kid who doesn't have any legs can smile while he's having an awesome time, I should never, ever feel bad about my life. It's there so that non-disabled people can look at us and think, well, it could be worse. I could be that person." In this way, these modified images exceptionalize and objectify those of us they claim to represent. It's no coincidence that these genuinely adorable disabled kids in these images are never named. It doesn't matter what their names are, as they're just there as objects of inspiration. So that's words from Stella. And it can also manifest in other ways. So you might have seen examples of like a non-disabled person asking a disabled person to the prom and then putting it on the internet, or a non-disabled person employing a disabled person and it making headlines. So the actions themselves aren't the inspiration porn, but the way it is spoken about and shared is the inspiration porn. There was a story that went around on the internet where a woman purchased and accepted a cake that was somewhat like messily decorated by an autistic person who was working in the cake shop. She then posted it online with a long story about how she accepted the cake and she was so kind, and it went viral, and the woman was praised for being so kind and patient, for accepting the cake. Like, how would you feel if this happened to you? These things are objectifying and dehumanizing disabled people. It sees them as burdens who are tolerated by heroes or angels, when really we should not tolerate the objectification or dehumanization of disabled people through inspiration porn or any means. So you can see that to be inclusive, we need to confront ableism. We need to think about the words that we use, the environments we work in, the behaviours we accept and in turn normalise. We need to question things, talk about things, and most importantly, listen to the stories of disabled people and their experience. It makes true inclusivity a whole lot easier and more real. So next slide. Oh, are you there, Kat? So moving on to neurodiversity. The term was coined by autistic sociologist Judy Singer in 1998, and it is very simply the diversity of human brains. So it's biological fact. So some people's brains are similar enough that they behave in ways that are categorized and labeled because it's kind of what we do as humans. And so some of these labels are typical, schizophrenic, bipolar, autistic, epileptic. And all of these labels except typical indicate neurodivergence, that is a deviation of a brain from society's expectation of normality. Not all neurodivergence is diagnosed or even diagnosable. This means that not all people who are perceived as neurotypical are in fact so. And it's not good or bad. A person can be born with it or it can be acquired. And it's up to each neurodivergent individual to decide what help they desire. So next slide is the neurodiversity paradigm. So the neurodiversity paradigm is a perspective on neurodiversity that sees it as a natural and valued part of human diversity, where there is no one right or normal type of brain or mind. So the following definition that I'm going to read, and there's a little bit of here on the slide, is from Nick Walker. And Nick is an autistic, genderqueer author, speaker, scholar, and educator. And you can find out more of their work on Neurocosmopolitan. Nick has some really, really valuable pieces on there. So Nick says the neurodiversity paradigm is a specific perspective on neurodiversity, a perspective or approach that boils down to these fundamental principles. One, that neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. Two, that the idea that there is one normal or healthy type of brain or mind or one right style of neurocognitive functioning is a culturally constructed fiction, no more valid and no more conducive to a healthy society or to overall well-being of humanity than the idea that there is one normal or right ethnicity, gender, or culture. And the third is that the social dynamics that manifest in regard to neurodiversity are similar to the social dynamics that manifest in regard to other forms of human diversity. For example, diversity of ethnicity, gender, or culture. These dynamics include the dynamics of social power inequalities and also the dynamics by which diversity, when embraced, act as a source of creative potential. So this is in contrast to the pathology paradigm, which medicalizes autism and other neurological differences and sees them as disorders needing cures. It assumes that there is one right, normal, or healthy way for brains to function. And if your brain deviates from this norm, then there is something wrong with you. So the narrative around autism, ADHD, and other neurominorities are steeped in the pathology paradigm. If anyone here has ever been through the diagnostic process for autism or similar, it's based purely on a set of deficits. And it can be a really difficult process to endure because you basically need to go in there and just say all the things that you're like bad at because that's what it's based on. It's based on deficits. But neurodivergents like autism are innate and are a fundamental part of a person's psyche, personality, and way of relating to the world. The neurodiversity paradigm does not pathologize these forms of neurodivergence and rejects attempts to cure or fix them. I think it's also worth mentioning that the neurodiversity paradigm does not object to pathologizing some forms of neurodivergence, such as epilepsy, because if they were removed from an individual, it would not erase fundamental aspects of that person's self. So next slide. If we're going into autism, so if you were to do a quick Google search on autism, this is some of the stuff that would come up. Serious developmental disorder, cannot show empathy, global health crisis caused by vaccines, a tragedy, burden, epidemic. And there's also talks of like really harmful cures, diets, and conversion therapies, which is ABA. And you also may have seen the puzzle piece in relation to autism. It's the most recognizable symbol for autism awareness. However, it was created without any input from actually autistic people. And it's still used widely today, despite many, many autistic people objecting to its original meaning and use. So if you ever see any campaigns, events, education, resources using the puzzle piece, I would just be wary of the information you are consuming because it may not have any input from actually autistic people. And there's just so much misunderstanding and fear around autism in the mainstream because of some really horrific awareness campaigns out there, particularly in America. It's seen as a defect or a disease that needs to be cured. There's this narrative of tragedy and burden. In the past, when some people have learned that my children are autistic, they've apologized. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And I say, why? Why are you sorry? There are so many assumptions that are made. Autism is not a tragedy. What is a tragedy is the narrative and the perceptions that surround autism and other neurominorities. They are hurting neurodivergent people. And I don't want that for my children, for my friends, for myself, for anyone, because no one's existence should be a tragedy. So next slide. What is autism? So Kel's got some handouts, some attachments, and she can post those tomorrow, I think. but there's a really good definition from Nick Walker, but it's really long, so I'm not going to read it. But hopefully you can get hold of that and check it out, because it's really thorough. It's one of the best definitions of autism that I've read. But I really liked this quote. I don't know the source. Autism means I miss what others catch and I catch what others miss. So autism is a type of brain wiring that processes information differently than typical brains do. This means that autistic thought patterns, sensory perceptions, social interactions, language processing, and emotional regulation all develop differently than those people who are not autistic. So if we look at the next slide, this is another great little infographic from Erin Human, which is also in the documents that you can get a hold of from Kel. So Erin mentions also that boys are more likely to be diagnosed than other genders, but that does not mean that they are more likely to be autistic. About 1 to 2% of the population, world's population, is autistic, and many populations are underdiagnosed, but autistic people are everywhere. So that was kind of a bit of a crash course, and some of that was a bit heavy, but I think it's really important stuff that we need to know and we need to be able to talk about, and maybe some of that was confronting or maybe not, but it's all really important things for us to know. So now that we've covered those things, I want to talk about Parkour, neurodivergent people, and inclusivity. So if we move to the next slide. So Parkour and neurodivergent people. I believe Parkour has many unique qualities that suit and support neurodivergent people, particularly neurodivergent children. These thoughts are based on my and my children's experiences with Parkour and how we feel about Parkour. Of course, everyone is different, and that includes neurodivergent people. But I believe there are some fundamental elements of Parkour that fit really well with neurodivergence. And so I want to share those thoughts with you and maybe see what you think. So if we move to the next slide. The first one is freedom. I love this word. Freedom, it opens me up. When I think of freedom, I immediately feel like taking a deep breath. I open up my shoulders, my chest, my back. I become taller. I take up more space. I don't feel restricted. I feel safe to be myself, and I feel acceptance. And freedom can feel like a lot of different things for different people. And for me, freedom ultimately feels like acceptance. And there's so much freedom in Parkour, right? It encourages freedom. It's one of the things that I love most about it. The freedom to move over, around, through, under any obstacle in a way that feels good to me. There's freedom of expression, freedom of creativity, freedom to make mistakes, freedom to explore. These things are encouraged, and they keep us motivated. They drive us to seek more from our environment and our bodies, and they drive us to learn more from our environment and our bodies. And Parkour is not really restrictive. And for neurodivergent people who are so often given the message that we're too much, or we're not enough, or damaged, broken, a burden, doing things wrong, or being in our bodies wrong, to be allowed the freedom to express ourselves through movement, however we want or need, is a welcome relief. And Parkour can give us that. So why else does Parkour suit us? I feel like the following points that I'm going to talk about feed off this notion or idea of freedom. So next slide. Creativity. Creativity in Parkour. Creativity is encouraged in Parkour. There is no one way to move through your environment. We can take restrictions away, or we can add restrictions as we wish. Seeing the world around us in a different way is embraced. All perspectives and all movements are valid. If you enjoy jumping, then jump. If spinning, rolling, and rocking feels good, then you spin, roll, and rock. If pressure on your body feels really good, then spend as much time as you want to exploring movement that fulfills your sensory profile. There is a huge scope for creativity, and for people whose brains are wired differently, who see the world differently, like, what an opportunity. Next slide. Parkour is non-competitive. So this is really important for neurodivergent people who find competition difficult. The expectation to perform and meet a certain level can be really damaging if you don't actually follow like a typical trajectory or way of learning, moving or interpreting things. Competition can bring up feelings of fear, performance anxiety, and failure, and it can take away the joy and the disappointment of not performing to a certain level or expectation can be really devastating for some people. I know this to be true for a few of my children. So next slide. Autonomy. We have autonomy over our bodies and how we move them. So really there are no rules as long as we're respectful and safe when it comes to parkour. If we need to move our bodies in certain ways or make certain sounds when we train, we can. If we need to follow a set pattern or ritual before each movement or during our movements, we can. We're the experts on our bodies and how we need to move them. Next slide. We can train parkour alone, parallel to others, or as a group. So having the option to choose who you train with and how is really important. Our moods, needs, feelings can all dictate who we want to train with and how we want to train at any given moment. So anxiety, crowds, sensory difficulties, social interaction, PTSD, injuries, our sense of safety, our perceptions can all have an effect on how we train. We might really want to be around other people, but we may not want to talk or interact. So we can go along to a jam or a training session and just be alongside our peers. No talking, but still feeling that connection alongside other humans. And that for some neurodivergent people is perfect. So I love that we have the option to choose. Next slide. Self-governed progressions. So progressions in parkour are self-governed and there's no formal grading system. We can choose when we're ready to add a layer or move to the next level in our training or movement practice. There are always progressions in parkour, which is great because that gives us an element of control, even when we may feel out of control in other areas of our life or even within our bodies. We have a choice about what we want to do or don't want to do with our body next. So I don't know if others can relate to any of those reasons or ideas that I have around why I think parkour suits neurodivergent people. You can comment if you like on that. So moving on to the next slide. And yeah, please feel free to add any comments or anything as we go through. And I have seen the box now, Kel, so I know where to look if there's something there. So what do we need to know? So neurodivergent people are fed this message of being broken, burdensome, damaged, too much, not enough. So often throughout our life, it makes feeling included and accepted as ourselves really difficult sometimes. So what do we need to know about neurodivergent people? People who aren't typical, who experience the world differently to the majority. What do we need to know and understand so that we can connect and work towards being more inclusive in our classes and in our communities? So I'm going to cover just some of the ways that autistic and neurodivergent people experience the world differently. And as I've said, I am not an expert on anyone else but myself. This is what I've learned from my own lived experience, from my experience as a mum to neurodivergent kids, and from the amazing neurodivergent friends and educators who have generously taught me so much. And I'm going to relate all these things to our parkour classes, communities and workshops so that we can work towards being more inclusive. So next slide. First thing is movement and sound. So we often need to move our bodies in atypical ways and feel things in our bodies in atypical ways. So flapping, jumping, shaking, clicking, rubbing, spinning, rolling, pressure on our bodies, all of these movements and feelings help us to stay regulated. help us to feel good, to relieve anxiety, to feel okay in the space that we take up in the world. We may need to make atypical sounds. So vocal stims or echolalia, which is the repetition of phrases, words, or parts of words. Other vibrational sounds like clicking, blowing raspberries. Again, this can help with regulation and allows feelings to be expressed. So in your classes, allow people to move freely and make sounds whenever you can. If they need to jump or flap or shake, allow them to. If they need to make sounds or repeat phrases or words, allow them to. Trust that it's what their bodies need to feel safe or regulated or present or happy or all of the above. Their boundaries are just as important as everyone else's, and if they're not hurting anyone or invading other personal space or causing a distraction, allow that expression to happen. And on this point, I think it's really important to be aware that neurodivergent people can listen in unexpected ways. So they don't need to be looking at you to be hearing you. In fact, standing still, looking at their instructor may make it harder to listen and understand. Remember that we all learn in different ways, and children are not exempt from this concept. So you may be unintentionally excluding young people from learning if you expect all your students to be still and completely silent when you are speaking. So if a student is avoiding eye contact or making sounds or moving their body while you're explaining something, please don't assume that they're not listening or hearing what you're saying. All these things may be in fact helping them to actually listen and learn and process. So next slide, stimming. So the things that I've mentioned above could all be forms of stimming, which is short for self-stimulatory behaviour. And this comes from a definition from Nick Walker, which says to stim is to engage in movement or in other activity that stimulates one or more of one's senses for the purpose, whether intentional or instinctive, of regulating one's own sensory motor experience or state of consciousness. So examples of stims can include activities such as rocking, hand movements, humming, drumming, touching a surface, or gazing at running water. Functions of stimming include, but not limited to, self-calming and self-soothing, inducing, enhancing, or responding to experiences of sensory pleasure, regulating sensory input, integration of information, and accessing specific capacities or states of consciousness. So everybody stims, we all stim. It's just that some stims are more socially acceptable than others. For example, I'll often twirl my hair, I tap my toe, bounce my leg. I'll often tap my fingers in specific patterns while repeating words or phrases in my mind. It really helps when I'm feeling anxious. When in conversations with someone, I'll often play with something. I need to have something in my hand, so sticks or leaves or peeling labels off bottles. Anything that helps me to shut out other distractions. It helps me to feel less vulnerable or exposed so that I can concentrate on the conversations that are happening. So these are all forms of stimming. When I was a kid, I whistled constantly. It drove my siblings crazy, or to distraction, I should say. And but it helped me to shut out external distraction. But it got too much for them, so I eventually stopped whistling. And my children have a lot of vocal stims, and our house can often be very, very noisy. So it can be difficult to manage sometimes. So it requires strategies like headphones or ear defenders, or brainstorming to come up with alternatives at times of high stress or auditory overload. My eldest son joyfully stims constantly. I love it. He has stimmed this way since he was 6 months old, and he's never been discouraged from that or shamed for it. Often when I feel energized, I'll have, and I don't know if anyone else can relate, I'll have this overwhelming urge to jump up and down or flap my hands around or make excited noises, but it's like it wants to burst out of me, but it's not really seen as socially acceptable for an adult to do that. So it often goes unexpressed in that moment, which is kind of sad. I love this. This is a quote from the Caffeinated Autistic, who says of stimming, "It is a message that says that I have so much to express and cannot hold it all inside, and I must show you right now. It is joy. It is an all-encompassing feeling that touches every part of me from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. What it isn't is shameful." So if you have people stimming in your class, particularly children, please do not discourage it. Help and encourage others to accept it. Stimming should never be stopped because it is considered socially inappropriate or makes others uncomfortable. It serves a purpose, and that should be respected. A lot of autistic children are trained, for a better word, to stop stimming, which is really sad. Particularly if it's not hurting anyone, if they're not hurting themselves. It's just a form of expression. So if stimming in your class is causing a distraction, if it's affecting other people's ability to learn, then you can work with the child or their parents or another autistic adult to find solutions that are respectful for everyone. So next slide. Communication. So neurodivergent people communicate in atypical ways, from echolalia and scripting to being very direct, to avoiding eye contact, to non-speaking communication. So let's cover a few of those. Eye contact can be physically painful for autistic people. I've also mentioned that we don't have to look at someone in the eyes to be good at listening. So again, please don't assume that someone isn't listening to you if they're not looking at you. Echolalia is another atypical way that neurodivergent people may communicate. It is the repetition of phrases, words, or parts of words, and is useful for a number of reasons. It can be used to stall or buy time for processing what is being said, so then that the person can then generate an answer. It can be used as a form of expression to engage or interact. If someone who uses echolalia repeats what you say, maybe they feel the same sentiment as you, or that's an easy way for them to relate and connect. It can also be a way to express needs and wants. So for example, if you ask someone in your class, would you like to try that jump again? And they use echolalia to communicate, they may repeat the sentence, would you like to try that jump again, while jumping up and down on the spot. So you could assume that they want to repeat the jump again. It can also be a self-soothing technique. Repeating comforting and familiar phrases can help them to feel safer, calm, regulated, or they're just fun to repeat, like lines from a movie. I know so many people who just communicate with their friends through lines from movies. And it can also be delayed, so this can be challenging. So sometimes someone may be communicating through echolalia, but it's from an event that happened 2 weeks ago, and if you weren't at that event, then there's no context for you, so it can be really difficult to figure it out. So sometimes it's just a matter of taking the time to get to know the ways people communicate and working with them and their communication needs. Scripting is something I've used quite a lot because spoken words don't always come naturally to me, and hence why I'm reading for this presentation. And I have social anxiety sometimes, so I'm much better at communicating through written word. So for me, scripting, I will practice conversations in my mind before they happen. I practice phone calls before I make them. I script conversations I might have with people who intimidate me, or situations that feel scary or that I'm anxious about. I might sit in a group and practice the answer to a question someone has asked over and over in my mind, and then never speak the words that I've practiced. So scripting mixed with social anxiety can be really exhausting. So sometimes interactions with autistic and neurodivergent people can come across as rehearsed or not natural because of scripting, but that doesn't mean that the communication is not genuine or sincere. And as Nick Walker pointed out in the definition of autism in the document that you'll be able to have a look at, autistic people are processing a lot of information at once. And this can mean that they don't have enough energy for social niceties in their communication. As a result, they can come across as blunt or rude. Again, this isn't intentional, and it shouldn't be assumed that the person you're communicating with is being rude. And then some autistic people don't speak at all, or may go through periods of not speaking. They may use AAC devices, or alternative and augmentative communication, or signing to communicate. There are so many ways to communicate, so always be prepared to accept and accommodate all different ways that people can and do communicate. And if you need help in accommodating someone's communication needs, then talk to them, talk to their parents, talk to neurodivergent adults to come up with helpful strategies. So next slide. Switching tasks. So a wonderful trait of many neurodivergent people is their ability to get completely lost in a task or activity, to become fully and completely immersed in an activity or concept that time and their presence in space can sort of disappear. It's a beautiful thing where amazing things can be achieved and all sorts of wonderful things can be created. But unfortunately, this state can be very much misunderstood and unappreciated, and neurodivergent people can be ripped away from these tasks and forced into a new one without a second thought from the person dictating the change of activity. This can result in anger, frustration, withdrawal, and upset, which is rarely acknowledged and often seen as an inconvenience or a problem. So this on the slide here you see is the tendril theory, another resource from Erin Human. And I think it really captures the difficulty in switching tasks when we're really in that zone, and how it can be really upsetting and damaging. And Erin writes of this theory, which went viral actually. She says, for people like me, the ability to delve deeply into a subject or a thought or an idea is not a deficit. It is something a deficit or something to overcome or deal with or work on improving. It is in fact one of our greatest strengths. Without people who think like us, the world would be a different and surely a less interesting place. When you see the face of the person whose tendrils are extended into thought, see that their face is blissful, meditative. This state of mind is restorative. It's a refuge from a world that is often overwhelming and chaotic and loud for people like us. When I ask the reader to please give me time to switch tasks when I'm ready, note that the words "when I'm ready" are quite specific. It doesn't say give me a little more extra time, an extra minute or a few more seconds. It asks you do not impose your timetable on me. So in a class setting or a workshop setting, if you know a child in your class has a hard time switching tasks, try and plan for that. Give plenty of notice when you're planning to change activities. And if someone in your class is on a roll with something and they're really in the zone, try to let them continue to do so if it's safe. Maybe you could assign an assistant instructor to them, or just keep an eye on them, and then allow them to join in with the new activity when they're ready. Flexibility is your friend in these situations. And the next slide is similar to switching tasks. Transitions can be challenging for autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people. For example, moving location in your class could be a source of anxiety. What will the new location be like? Will it be noisy? Will it smell differently? Will it have more people around? How far away is it? Why are you moving location? There may be many unknowns that could be difficult to navigate. So when making transitions in class, give as much information as possible. Let your class know where you are moving to and why, what activity you'll be doing, what you expect from your students, what your students can expect. The more information you can give, the better, and this will lessen anxiety and in turn, any challenges or challenging behaviour that may result from anxiety. Okay, next slide. Sensory differences. So everyone has their own unique sensory profile that can change from week to week, day to day, and even minute to minute. Neurodivergent people can feel and experience sensory input more intensely than neurotypical people, often to the point that it can significantly disable us. We may be under or over responsive to sensory input, or we may seek or crave certain types of input. So just to give you an example, when it comes to my family, I'm very sensitive to sounds, particularly when many sounds are blended together, which can make processing information really difficult and almost painful at times. My 9-year-old is over responsive to smells and finds seemingly slight smells very offensive and extremely difficult to be around sometimes. My 7-year-olds can have under-responsive proprioception and bump into people and objects all the time. We're all over-responsive to tactile input, so very sensitive to the way things feel in our bodies. My 7-year-old will almost never wear more than one layer of clothing, ever. So if he's wearing a t-shirt and it's cold, he'll take his t-shirt off and put a jumper on. So it's kind of lucky that we live in Perth. I also hate layers. I really hate layers on my body. So my daughter finds seams in socks almost unbearable. And my boys hate shoes. They call them prison for their feet. They rarely ever wear shoes, almost never when they're in parkour class or when they're training. And these examples of sensory input can be more or less intense at different times and for different reasons. So you can imagine if you were to experience sensory overload or discomfort during a class or a workshop, it would be incredibly difficult to concentrate or take in any information. So some things that may help in accommodating different sensory profiles in your classes are to have a designated place where people can go if they need some time to themselves or to be away from the activity. Allow fidgeting and movement as much as possible. A person may seem inattentive or fidgety because they're craving some kind of sensory input. So as much as possible, allow them to move their bodies in ways they need to so they can feel regulated and satisfied. Allow people to wear ear defenders or headphones whenever they need to. Be mindful of the environment around you. Are there any sights, sounds, smells that may cause discomfort for others? Can these be mitigated or avoided in any ways? Be clear and patient when explaining activities. Over and under responsive sensory input can make taking in directions and instructions difficult. Is it safe to allow participants to take off their shoes? Always ask a person, the child or the adult, how you can help accommodate someone with their sensory sensitivities or difficulties. You can also ask parents and other autistic adults for their input. Next slide. Executive function. So this is a broad term that refers to the cognitive processes that help us regulate, control, manage our thoughts and actions. It includes planning, working memory, attention, problem solving, verbal reasoning, inhibition, cognitive flexibility, initiation of actions, and monitoring of actions. If you have poor EF, people might mistake you for being disorganized, lazy, incompetent, sloppy, or just plain not very bright. Why? Because executive function encompasses so many essential areas of daily living. Nearly everything we do calls on areas of executive function: cooking, cleaning, parenting, work, school, self-care. So impaired EF is common among neurodivergent people, particularly autistic and ADHD people, and affects each person differently. It's generally managed by developing unique coping strategies that suit the individual and can take time to figure out. In the instance of our classes and community settings, it's just helpful to know that this is a thing, that executive dysfunction exists, and it's something to be aware of. Some strategies that may help in class settings, particularly with kids: keep them moving as much as possible, which can help keep them focused and stay on track. Try to keep instructions short and repeat them multiple times. Whenever you can, give visual demonstrations. Include your students in the decision-making process so it feels clearer to them. Don't force students to contribute or participate if they aren't comfortable. Maybe they aren't quite understanding everything that's happening yet, and they may need to observe for a while. Or they may need a little longer to process the information that's being communicated, so give them time. If someone doesn't seem to be participating but isn't causing any distractions and is safe, is it possible to leave them be? And just try to cut people some slack. presume that they're doing the best that they can, and offer some help in developing strategies to manage. So in summing up with these areas that neurodivergent people can find difficult, we can see that shifting our perspective around these things that neurodivergent people find challenging can be so helpful when we're trying to be inclusive. If we see something as a difference rather than a problem or a behavior that needs to be fixed or stopped or controlled, our whole attitude and perspective starts to change, right? It opens us up to be more curious. It allows us to see people as individuals. It encourages us to build connection and inclusivity. So we're almost there. This brings us to our next slide. So going into inclusivity now. So inclusivity to me means that everyone feels safe, heard, respected, and supported in being themselves. So I just want you to think now, for those that are with us, about something that you know about yourself that makes you feel vulnerable in a class or a group setting. It might be something that makes it difficult for you to feel safe or included. It could be a disability, a mental illness, a fear, a phobia, your gender, your race, PTSD. It could even be a thought or belief or story that you have about yourself. So once you have that thought, I want you to think about why that thing makes it hard for you to feel safe or included. And what helps you to feel safe or included despite this difference that you might have. So as an example, I'll share my own experience around something about myself that leaves me feeling vulnerable and often unsafe in my body. I have anxiety, and social anxiety is a big one for me, which is a fear and anxiety response around social interaction. I've felt this way for as long as I can remember, my whole life. And I believe it's partly to do with the way my brain is wired, and also has been exacerbated by trauma I experienced as a young child. It's also certainly something that I have been able to manage and build strategies around as I've gotten older, and now it's something that doesn't cause me too much grief at all at the moment, which is great. So why does social anxiety make it harder for me to feel safe or included in a group or class setting? Well, having social anxiety means that taking information in can be very difficult. So you see, apart from just listening to what the teacher or instructor is saying at the front of the class, I'm also thinking about a whole range of other things which stem from anxiety, which lead me to being in a hypervigilant state, which in some cases leads me to being unable to take in or retain any information. My body begins to exhibit physiological reactions or responses as a result of feeling unsafe. My heart rate goes up, my face flushes whenever I speak, my stomach churns, I begin to sweat a lot, I get delayed auditory processing, my thoughts can become obsessive or almost paranoid. Essentially, I'm in that fight or flight state, and I can't process information, I can't learn, I don't feel safe in my body. This doesn't happen to me anywhere near as much now as an adult, but when I was a kid, it was exhausting and scary. And it could stem from a number of things. It could be a teacher who always calls people out randomly and asks them questions. That for me as a kid was terrifying. Even when I knew the answer, I hated it so much. Or doing a group activity where I have to share about myself. I actually quite like doing that now as an adult, but I hated it as a kid. Or needing to ask a question in the middle of class, or making a mistake, or like even blowing my nose or getting up to go to the toilet would result in an anxiety response within my body. So what helped me feel safe and included despite my anxiety? Definitely feeling competent in the activity I was doing helped, but mainly it was the teachers and peers showing me it was okay to make mistakes. The teachers who noticed me and saw my struggles, who didn't pass judgment or bring attention to my fears or insecurities in front of others, who respected my boundaries, didn't push me to do something that I wasn't comfortable with, who helped me to feel safe. And how did they do all these things? It was really quite simple, just by noticing, by talking, by asking questions, by sharing their vulnerabilities, by creating connection. So I would normally ask if anyone wanted to share, but I will leave it because we've already gone for an hour and I just have a few more slides to get through. So we're going to go to the next one now, and then we'll have time for some questions if anyone wants to share. So what can we do to help neurodivergent people feel safer and more included in our communities? So talk to us. Talk to your students, your community members when they appear to be having a difficult time. It seems like an obvious thing, but so often disabled people are not included in conversations about them or their needs, particularly children. Get to know them, ask questions, become interested in their life. Ask what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy. Encourage chatting during classes and during transitions. If you're having trouble communicating effectively with someone, particularly a child, talk to their parents, a carer, a trusted friend, or get in touch with an autistic or neurodivergent advocate or educator, and they will be able to help immeasurably. It can be dangerous and unhelpful to make assumptions about someone's behaviour. They could feel anxious, scared, overwhelmed. So ask questions. Next one is respect. So next slide. Respect disabled people and their boundaries, particularly for children. Children's boundaries are constantly overridden. They're not believed, they're coerced, they're bullied. This is something that really upsets me and bewilders me. Children are people too. But it's like so many adults simply do not see the children in front of them as fully formed humans who deserve respect and kindness. How would it be for the children who come to your classes to find solace and safety in your company and your community? If someone in your class tells you that what is happening is too scary, too loud, too smelly, uncomfortable, confronting, or overwhelming, believe them. Just believe them. Be aware and respectful of their boundaries. Don't push them, because this could result in overwhelm, it could result in anxiety or aggression, or it could result in a student simply not returning to your class or your community because they don't feel safe. There are also so many opportunities for progressions and alternatives in what we teach, so always make that okay. There are opportunities to sit and watch, and sometimes observation can be just as valuable and create a sense of safety and acceptance. So don't push or force compliance, because ultimately it doesn't achieve anything helpful. It's our job to earn the trust of our students, and we can only do that if we respect them and their boundaries. Okay, next slide. Avoid making assumptions. So it can be very easy to make assumptions about someone's behaviour or actions, especially children who are behaving in ways that seem destructive. If we can firstly remember that behaviour is communication, and there is always a reason someone is acting in ways that may be challenging or unsettling. Maybe they're in sensory overwhelm. Is it too loud? Are there unpleasant or strong smells? Are they feeling uncomfortable in some other way? Maybe they're acting in an aggressive or controlling way because they are scared or anxious. Maybe they need more instruction or reassurance or time with what they are working on. So take a deep breath and try to connect with them. Then work out how you can help them to feel more comfortable. I also want to quickly mention, this is important, that using functioning labels for autistic people, like high functioning and low functioning, is actually really unhelpful and quite harmful. And if you take the time to actually think about it, it's really quite insulting. Assigning functioning labels to someone immediately results in unhelpful assumptions being made about that person. So low functioning, for example, assumptions made that they're not competent, that they are less than, they're not able to make decisions for themselves, their humanity is taken away. And high functioning, the assumptions made that they don't need support, their struggles are diminished. they should be able to fit in. They don't act or look autistic. Instead of using functioning labels, use support labels instead. So you can say they have high support needs or low support needs. It's a lot more respectful and it avoids unhelpful assumptions. So next slide. Striving for connection. So at the end of the day, I believe that real inclusivity needs connection. Otherwise, how can it really work? We can do all the research and we can check all the boxes and do all the checklists, which are all good things to be doing, but without real connection, it's almost meaningless and we'll never really achieve true inclusivity. We need to make sure we're stepping out of our own experiences, that we're looking at things from different perspectives, continuing to educate ourselves and keep an open mind, and always including marginalised people like neurodivergent people in the discussion around inclusivity, asking them what they need to feel safe and included. We can never really know how far a person has come out of their comfort zone, outside of what feels safe for them to come to one of our classes or to come into our community and our environment and meet us where we are at. So as teachers and leaders and mentors, how far are we willing to go to ensure that they feel safe and accommodated and accepted? My experience of the Parkour community is that it's one of the most welcoming and encouraging and friendly communities that I've ever encountered. I believe at its heart, it's naturally very inclusive because of the values that it was built upon and because of the attitudes of the people that are already in it. So I think that we need to continue to always strive for connection, because I believe it's so much easier to be inclusive when we feel connected. And I just wanted to finish on this last quote, the last slide, from Toni Morrison, because I love it so much. When a child walks into the room, your child or anybody else's, do your eyes light up? That's what they're looking for. I don't know if anyone who's watching has been lucky enough to be on the receiving end of a teacher's eyes lighting up when you walk in the room, but it feels really, really good. And I think a lot of neurodivergent kids could really do with experiencing this feeling. So that's what I'm going to leave you with. That's all from me. We just went over an hour, so thank you so much for those that are here. If anyone has any questions or anything to share, please do. If you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on Instagram at paula.flynn or on Facebook at Paula Flynn, and just shoot can. And yeah, if you have any questions about the handouts that Kel can share with everyone, let me know. But that's it from me. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Paula. That was wonderful. Extending things from all of us to you. I might just throw a couple of questions at you while everyone else maybe has a think. The one thing that occurred to me was that a common thing is that people may feel tactile contact or standing close as something that is overwhelming or painful to them. So when you're structuring a class, do you avoid anything that would require spotting, or is that something that you just have to talk through more?
Yeah, it's something that I guess it depends if you know who's in your class, and you know, if there's certain kids or people that you know that would avoid that kind of activity, then you would have in your mind something else that they can do or that you can do as a class. But always just saying that it's okay, you know, that you don't have to do anything that that we're kind of prescribing, and just having those backups for activities in the back of your mind, and always being able to implement them is kind of how I've approached that. Yeah.
Great, wonderful. And another thing that kind of occurred to me was that, you know, often when neurodivergent or anybody is at the mercy of sensory overwhelm, it will present something like, you know, what people would dismiss as a tantrum or something like that. If that were to happen in a class, what do you think is best practice for a coach to approach that?
Yeah, it's difficult because it depends if you've got not all coaches have the luxury of like an assistant, or obviously you would want to try and take the attention away from the person who's going through sensory overwhelm. We don't want people crowding around. We don't want people looking at them. So if you're on your own, I would try to make sure that that person is safe, and move the class to an activity, and then come over to them, let them know that I'm there, but not impose myself on them. And sometimes just a matter of waiting. It's really difficult though, because everyone is so unique and needs different things in that time. And if you have a child, hopefully their parents are able to have spoken to you about, you know, the possibility of that happening, and maybe what might help during, if that were to happen in a class. But really, I think a lot of people, when they are in sensory overwhelm or meltdown, kind of, they can feel a lot of shame. You know, it's not something that they want to be happening. They don't have any control over it. So really just trying to make sure that that there's no ridicule, and there's no making them feel bad for what they're going through. Yeah, but it's a tough one. I don't know if I answered that very well.
Oh, great. There's an excellent question here from Dominic. I might as well read it out here. Have you ever met with a critical parent or someone who felt that your way of teaching is wrong?
No, I haven't yet. I haven't. But I do know that when I presented over in America, and this was a concern for some people, that the parents wanted things done in a certain way for their child, that for them as instructors didn't feel respectful, or and you know, my advice in that scenario would be, obviously you need to respect a parent's choices, of course, for their child, but I would provide them with some information from autistic adults from within that community, and hopefully, you know, maybe it just plants a seed. But if a parent wants something done a specific way for their child, then obviously you need to respect that, if it's of course, as long as it's not harmful. But yeah, that's difficult, and I haven't actually experienced it myself with any of the classes that I've been in. Yeah. I mean, if anyone else has any thoughts on that, then I'd love to hear it as well.
It seems like Parkour somewhat self-selects for people that want freedom for their children. So I have a similar thing. I've only encountered it a couple of times. So there's something.
I think it might be more. Yeah, and also all of the classes that I teach are outdoors, and I think potentially indoor classes at gyms, it might happen more, because I don't know if there's even if there's a different vibe there, or there's just bigger classes. I'm not too sure. Maybe I'll have to think on that, but yeah.
I just have another question regarding your experience. When you made the sort of transition from being a student to a coach yourself, were there requirements, you know, if our organisations want to support autistic young people and adults to become themselves coaches, do you have advice in that?
Like make it more accommodating, or
Yeah.
yeah, I think for me, the transition has been okay. Like the Perth community is really, really awesome, and you know, being inclusive is very like top priority. But yeah, I mean, I guess depending on what kind of accommodation someone might need, it really just depends. I guess if for qualifying, if for quals, you know, if there's certain requirements to have to get up and talk, or I don't know, if that's really, really intimidating, then I don't see why we shouldn't be able to offer other ways of delivering information. Or I mean, I think it just really comes down to talking to the person. And the catch-22 is that you really have to show that you're inclusive and that you care from the start, because if you don't, then people aren't going to tell you what they need, because they're going to be too scared to tell you what they need, because they're going to seem like there's something wrong with them, or they're going to be a burden, or they don't deserve it. So I think just being open and accepting from the start with all of your correspondence and all that you're saying, and then people are like, oh, okay, so it's okay if I find this hard, then maybe I can tell them, it's safe for me to tell them. I think that's really that's where we need to start. And then from there, you know, people can share what accommodations they might need. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for being so open about your own experiences. And I think you're absolutely spot on that when we are inclusive from the get-go, as well as open and vulnerable to people around us, then we can build safer learning environments.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, whether we're neurodivergent or not, we all struggle with things. And if we can make that normal and share and connect, then I don't see why we can't be inclusive all the time. Yeah.
I could ask questions all day. I've just got one more, and I'm not sure if this is in your wheelhouse, but a lot of another neurodivergence that a lot of parkour coaches see is attention deficit, ADHD type things. Is there a lot of overlap between autistic people and ADHD?
Yeah. From, I mean, I don't know as much about ADHD. You know, I have friends who are, and their children, and but from what I've read, and a lot of the I can 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 of my autistic friends are autistic and ADHD. So there's a lot of overlap, I think. So I think a lot of this that I went through is kind of relevant as well. But of course, there's more intricacies and things to ADHD that I'm not aware of. So yeah, but there's definitely, from what I've read and know, definite overlaps. Yeah.
Excellent, because obviously stimming behaviour is part of that as well, and well, as you said, everyone stimms. So wonderful. Again, I can't thank you enough for your presentation and for being so open with all of us. And as Paula mentioned, she's collated and provided some handouts and resources. Sorry, my vocab's gone. So I'll make sure they're available wherever this video is. And just again, thanks to Paula for your time. And as Paula said, you can. I'll put links to Paula's website as well as to her Instagram. She's a fantastic breathwork and movement coach, and a wealth of expertise. Again, thank you to the Australian Parkour Association for their support. And if you would like to see more of these lectures happen, you can kick in a few bucks at our PayPal. I'll put links to all that everywhere. And thank you all so much.
Thanks, Cal. Thank you, everyone.
All right, I'll hit end. Good night, everyone.